Welcome to Moments with Marianne. Allow me to interrupt your train of thought with something that may be one of the most interesting things you hear today. This is your host, Marianne Pastana, and we're here today with special guest, Jennifer Kreatsoulas, and she's here to share with us her new book, The Courageous Path to Healing, when commitment to yourself and your recovery becomes your greatest teacher. So welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Marianne.
Well, what an honor it is to have you here on the show. I know we talked about your last book, Body Mindful Yoga, last time. So I'm excited that we get to talk about this book. What inspired you to write this?
Well, for me, the inspiration came from this deep place within myself to reflect on my own story of going through an eating disorder and recovering from an eating disorder and thinking about what shaped my healing, what helped my healing. And so the book is, each chapter includes a pivotal moment from my story. Just a one moment from different parts of my story, and leads into a reflection on what did I learn from that moment? Like, what was the wisdom that I gained from that difficulty or that challenge or that suffering? And then invite readers to reflect on their own journey, using these pivotal moments for my own as kind of windows into their own journey, where they get to look at their own sense of courage and strength and bravery and the steps that they've taken to shape their healing. And each chapter also includes a yoga inspired reflection practice. So not necessarily doing, yoga poses, but more inspired by some of the concepts and the teachings of yoga, and some check-in questions for people who enjoy journaling and that type of reflection.
Well, I'm so glad you wrote this book and shared your courageous healing story in it, because it's such a journey. And I think it's a journey that a lot of people are going through. I mean, especially now we're hearing about the COVID-15, and for some people it's a COVID-50, so how do we get to this place where we start looking at our behaviors and start making those changes?
Well, I mean, I think that's an important question, certainly a big question. Just maybe, if you don't mind, I can just share what eating disorders are.
That would be great. Yeah.
And to say that my book, I think, speaks to the larger human experience of just being human and suffering and having challenges, right? So for listeners who don't experience an eating or haven't experienced an eating disorder, that doesn't exclude you from this conversation by any stretch of the means, right? Because we're really talking about, the challenges that we face in life and how they affect the way we see ourselves and how we relate to the world, how they affect our emotions and our relationship with our bodies. And so I'm really speaking to the larger human experience, but specifically, eating disorders affect 70 million people worldwide, and they affect people of all ages. We sort of have it in our social consciousness that eating disorders affects, white teenagers who are, middle, upper class, and that they're emaciated, and certainly that population is part of the eating disorder community. But it's important to understand that eating disorders affect people of all ages, all sizes, all colors, all genders, all socioeconomic backgrounds. Yes, we hear now children as young as 8 beginning to suffer with eating disorders. And there are people in their 70s who are still struggling with eating disorders. And they don't look one specific way. So you don't have to be emaciated to be struggling with an eating disorder. You can have any body size, any body shape. And there are various types of eating disorders. And so I always recommend people to check out the National Eating Disorder Association website to learn more about the different types and the symptoms that go with that. But the point that I would really love to make is that eating disorders, though they play out in one's relationship with body and food, and that is certainly very real components of this mental illness, they're really ways to cope with pain, with trauma, with hard things that have happened in life. And that's, I think, the shared experience that we all have, that we all have had hard things happen in our lives. And if we look closely and get really honest with ourselves, we all have tried to cope in ways that maybe aren't always the healthiest, but they're not done, with the intention of hurting ourselves, right? We all struggle with how to cope with what's hard. And so, yes, eating disorders are very destructive, and they are the second most fatal mental illness, second to opioid addiction. But it's important to know that those struggling aren't setting out to hurt themselves. They're setting out to try to cope and survive. So recovery is very much the process of retraining how we cope with our pain and finding new, more helpful and healthful ways to cope with our pain.
Well, thank you for going over that, because it's, I really appreciate how your book, again, just doesn't cover one issue. It's just like any challenge that we're facing today. And you start off your book with perfectionism.
Mm-hmm.
Why was that?
I think because that was certainly one of the major ingredients of my personality that maybe served me when I was younger, right? As, in grade school and high school, and getting straight A's and, excelling at sports. And, I was really lucky to be one of those kids. But as I got older and into college, really became aware of how that drive to be perfect was creating a lot of suffering, never wanting to disappoint people, wanting to be the best at everything, pushing myself to extremes to be the best. And how, the accumulation of years of doing that led me to then, self-destruct, right? Because the fear of not being the best, the fear of disappointing people, not being approved of, not meeting, checking off all the boxes, that pressure became so profound and heavy. And I also started with perfectionism because I think a lot of people struggle with it. We live in a world that encourages it, that makes it a value. So I know I just had a sense that a lot of people could really relate to that drive to be perfect and understand the pain that can come from that.
I really appreciate how in your book you also have practices that people can use to kind of work through what we're trying to work through. So in this case, it's perfectionism. And, how true is it that, so many people that we come across are dealing with, having to excel or having to do better or having to have more. It ends up in this kind of more cycle. And it's interesting, when people achieve more, doesn't necessarily mean that they're happier.
Mm-hmm. So true.
So what are some practices people can do that would just help them release some of their perfectionism? Because I know that's kind of a big thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's probably, many different ways that can be explored. But the one that I offer in my book is a practice called Hold It Lightly. And this is a practice I do myself and I do with my yoga therapy clients. And it's the idea that when we're striving for something that we want to be perfect at, or that we want to be, we want to get that A or that gold star, or, we're in this place of, our physical selves are very clenched. It's like everything is tense. Our shoulders are tense. Our jaw is tense. We're like, our hands are tense. Like everything is tense. We're gripping so hard at trying to bring something perfect into the world, right? And so I often invite people to just hold their hands out in front of them and imagine they're putting that thing that they're clenching, that they're grasping in their hands, and then just squeeze it. And to notice that sensation that happens in the body when we are gripping our hands and clasping them so tight. The tension in the hands builds up the arms and into the shoulders, the neck, the face, right? But if we then do the opposite and we just open our hands softly and imagine we're holding the thing that we're worried about or striving to perfect. If we could just hold it lightly in our hands. Well, we notice that when our hands are in a lighter shape, that tension in the arms and the shoulders and the neck dissolves. And literal light can be shed on your palms, right? So if we imagine that thing in your hands, now with your hands open, there's new light on it. You can turn your hands from side to side, and maybe you can look at this thing that you're worried about and get a new perspective, a new angle. I'm sorry. So when we're grasping, that is our cue. When we're clinging and trying so hard, that is our cue to actually do the opposite and just hold that a little lighter, get a little space from it, and you might notice something that you didn't notice before. And one of those things might be, oh, I've done enough on this project already. I can let it go now, right? Or, oh, I don't have to, force myself to have this done in an hour. I can have till the end of the day, right? Like, we just might be able to create a little space between ourselves and the thing that we're worrying so much about. So hold it lightly. That's the practice that I go to.
What a great practice that is. And thank you for sharing that with us. So, in your book, you talk about own our truth. What does that mean? I think for a lot of people, they're kind of looking at that going, well, I think I do that every day, but what does it mean?
Well, I think it can mean a lot of things. When I think about it, it's this idea of, for myself, just being really honest with myself about where I am in this moment, right? So how am I feeling physically? What's going on with me emotionally? What are my thoughts about? And can I just observe what's coming, what those answers are without judging them and just allowing them to be? So if I'm feeling depressed, can I observe that? Can I notice that and not judge it or shame myself for having a down day, right? And rather than shame myself, can I say, okay, I've been here before. What helps me? What's helped me in the past? What do I know to be true about what's helped me in the past? And what steps can I take to help myself right now? So I think it's that permission to not shame ourselves for aspects of our reality that maybe we believe are being judged by the outside world.
Do you find that sometimes the things that we're being judged by are actually something that ends up being beneficial to our life?
I mean, I'm a big believer, and this is a big theme in my book, is that, a lot of times our challenges are our greatest teachers. It's I think a really helpful reframe if we can, sure, be true to ourselves about how these challenges are affecting us emotionally, physically, mentally, right? And then when we get to a point where we've been able to kind of process the challenge, well, what has it taught me? What has it shown me about how strong I am, or my ability to love, or my ability to try new things, or take a risk, or be courageous. I'm a big believer in kind of doing that reflection, because if we reframe our pain from the things that break us to the things that teach us, then we can get a new perspective on why life is going the way it is. And we can connect with some gifts that maybe we didn't even know that we had, like this ability to persevere through, in my case, eating disorder recovery. Right? I think perseverance is a value that we don't talk about enough. I mean, we're all persevering every day in one way or another, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in big ways, sometimes in really traumatic and tragic ways. So yeah, I really want through this book to reflect to people their own perseverance. What they've gone through to get to where they are, and the value of perseverance that they've had to practice to do that.
So, Jennifer, how important is community as we go through this process of handling our challenges and looking at them in new ways?
Well, for me, I mean, community has been everything. And I've been really blessed to find community through my eating disorder journey, whether that's, with the eating disorder community itself, whether it was through the different yoga communities that I've been a part of, and various other communities. But I think for me and what I've experienced, and now what I try to do for the people that have joined my community, is offer validation. I feel like one of the greatest ways that we we find healing is through being seen and heard. And when we find a community of people who really get it, you know, um, there's a great power in that, feeling seen, feeling heard, and feeling validated. And so, as a community leader, that's what I strive to offer. And for myself, that has been momentous, absolutely momentous.
So, I know that you are this great, certified yoga therapist. At what point did you realize that there was a connection between yoga and just being able to work through challenges?
So I think that came most um, clearly when I was doing my yoga therapy training. So this training occurred for me after I relapsed from the eating disorder. Um, I had two very small children at that time. And during the relapse, kind of got honest with myself about needing to bring yoga back into my life because it had fallen to the side once I got married and had children and a career. And so it was during my yoga therapy training where I was learning about classical yoga, and I was learning about the different concepts and philosophies and how we can use practices. And I don't mean like practices like you go to a yoga class and you do an hour of yoga. I mean more like, how can we use just, 3 minutes of breathing to help ourselves in this moment? How can we use, 2 minutes of mindful movement to help calm spinning thinking? How can we use a concept, perhaps say ahimsa, which is non-harming or peacefulness, to help change our narrative when it comes to confronting, say, self-judgment. So my yoga therapy training really, really brought into focus yoga as healing, as lifestyle, as a way to engage with ourselves in the world and suffer less.
As a yogi myself, I love my yoga practice. It just kind of brings me to being in that moment. Do you feel that that's what really kind of starts helping people with their healing process? Is just kind of focusing on the moment in front of them?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really wonderful benefits, and I teach this in my training that I offer to professionals who are interested about the role of yoga in eating disorder recovery. Right, so it's definitely what you said, Marianne. This idea of learning how to be in the moment and how to be with ourselves in the moment, which isn't always a comfortable thing, right? That doesn't always come easy. It takes practice, right? So this idea of being here now, being in the moment, certainly for eating disorder recovery, because living with an eating disorder is so much about escaping the body, turning away from it, numbing it, ignoring it. Um, the severing that happens between the mind and body becomes so severe, right? And we know that the mind and body aren't separate, but the experience of living with an eating disorder creates them to be very separate. So the practices of yoga, I always like to say, help us turn toward our bodies instead of away from them, like living with an eating disorder does. right? So when we learn that we can actually turn toward our body to help ourselves in a hard moment, for example, taking those 3 breaths, that's like a huge paradigm shift for someone who's been turning away from their body, right? So this idea of turning toward the body is huge. I think these practices, certain types of practices can be very beneficial for the nervous system. I mean, I think all practices are, but certainly from a standpoint of recovery, that down regulation is so important because, going through the process of healing is a very anxiety ridden thing, right? So even though you may be someone who's on your path to recovery, you may also have a lot of anxiety about it, because you're being forced to have to live a new way that can be very scary. So helping people to down regulate anxiety, calm spinning thinking, is also another huge benefit. And then, just embodiment itself, getting to know one's body again, getting to learn how to be with one's body in a kind way, how to respect it, appreciate it, how to move it, how to pay attention to it. I think the benefits, we could probably have a whole show on the benefits of this. But there are some of the keys that I always really hone in on with my clients.
Yeah, I can understand that completely. And I appreciate you sharing that with us because the practice of yoga is such a personal journey once you start getting into it. Because, I mean, you talk about like kind of seeing where your body can go. I mean, some people, their body, they're twisted up like a pretzel, and other people are just like, hey, I could touch my toes and I'm good.
Yeah. And so it's kind of, certainly what I teach and train others is that, we need to really let go of this idea that there's like ideal ways to do these poses. We need to move away from the focus on the outcome of, the shape and the experience of creating it and breathing with it and being with it. And that there is no ideal, and helping people give themselves permission to not touch their toes, giving them permission to bend their knees, giving them permission to not prove themselves through their bodies, that there's no perfect here. That is really key for recovery. And I think that is an important direction for all of our yoga spaces, especially here in the States, to move toward, because I think there's a very competitive, fitness focused vibe in a lot of yoga spaces that just aren't safe for certain populations.
Yeah, and I know when I go to a yoga class, you could tell sometimes there's a little competition in who can do what.
Yeah,
Am I competing with my neighbor, whoever's on their mat next to me,
absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So that's why trauma informed or trauma sensitive classes can be so beneficial for individuals, in trauma recovery, eating disorder recovery, any kind of recovery, or just for maybe even a kinder yoga experience. Because those teachers who lead that are specifically trained to lead classes that are um, not about competition. And there's certain aspects of those classes that make them very safe. At least their intention is to be safe. We can't always know how people are going to receive, what's being taught, but the intention is safe. There's a very big emphasis on language, which is what I teach also. A lot of invitation to explore versus commanding to do. And so I always encourage people to look for studios that offer trauma informed or trauma sensitive classes, or at least have teachers on their staff with that training in their bios.
Yeah, that's such an important piece. Yeah, if someone's doing yoga at home, how can they really listen to their bodies? What are some things that they should pay attention to?
So I think, the practice of learning to pay attention is a practice. It takes time, right? And so perhaps, when you begin your practice, just reminding yourself, okay, I'm going to really focus on listening to myself today. I'm not going to ask more than my body has to give. I'm going to honor my energy levels. I'm going to honor my mood, right? I'm going to just have an experience and let go of any need for it to look or be a certain way, right? So some of this kind of self-talk, listening to the cues that your body is giving you, right? No need to be in pain. No need to push past a point that you know is not good for your mind or your body. Your breath can be a great indicator of kind of if you're pushing too hard, right? So if you can't breathe, maybe you're striving too much. If you're holding your breath, that's your cue to kind of take some breaths, right? Just giving yourself permission to find your way with learning how to listen to yourself is a key, because we're not really taught how to listen to ourselves. We're usually taught to push through. So taking your practice slowly, and maybe after every couple poses, just pausing and checking in, seeing how you're doing. Do you want to continue? Do you want to stop? Right? What's your vibe? Do you want to be on your feet? Do you want to be on your back? Yeah, just finding the questions to ask yourself.
How important is it that we treat ourselves with self-compassion?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm biased. I'm going to say it's very important. Right? Because, I mean, if each person listening thinks to themselves, what's the opposite of self-compassion for them? A lot of people are going to say things like judgment, criticism, shame, guilt, comparison, right? Or people might be thinking, well, I can give compassion to others, but not myself. Think if those are the types of answers that are coming to you, then, this is an area that's really important that you give yourself permission to work on, because I think without giving ourselves a little grace, we're just going to continue to be really hard on ourselves. We're not going to break those cycles of perfectionism and comparison without a little space and a little grace, for self-compassion.
So in your book, you talk about self-worth. So how do we get to this point of like either reclaiming or identifying that we're not in this place where we feel that we're worthy?
Well, it's certainly a journey, and it's a commitment, right? To do this work. I think for me, it was learning the word and, the power of the word and, that I could be a mother, care for my children, and make time for myself, right? Because by making time for myself, I'm acknowledging that I'm worthy of that time, right? That I can, have a busy morning and remember to eat lunch, right? Like take the time to eat lunch. Because in doing that, I'm saying to myself, you're worthy of that, right? I can, there's millions of examples, but when we can put an and in a lot of the statements, or we typically put a but, I can't do this because, and but, or however you speak to yourself, when you realize that there's an and, that there is room for you. And by making that room in your life for you, you're acknowledging your worth, right? If we continue to just keep cutting ourselves out of our lives, then it's going to be hard to connect with a sense of self-worth. And so I encourage people to begin with small ways that they can build themselves into their lives, whether that's sitting out in the sun for 5 minutes and just having a break from taking care of others, from serving, from giving, from creating, from performing, just 5 minutes. And in those 5 minutes that you give yourself, you're acknowledging that you have worth. Right? So I like to approach it from a very practical, hands-on way like that. I think we can talk ourselves into believing that we're worthy, but we also have to practice it. So giving yourself permission to make yourself a priority. That's what helped me.
Well, obviously, I'm so just impressed with your book. I thought there was so much good information that you had in there for people. And I think everyone's pretty much got a I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough kind of story that goes in their head, no matter how successful or prominent they may look.
Absolutely. I agree with you because it's part of the human experience, right? And unfortunately, we live in a world that is so um, focused on comparison and status, and it's difficult to not bump up against those narratives. So let's normalize that they're out there and give people permission to challenge them.
Do you find that people look at healing as if it's this linear thing, like, okay, I did this workshop, I've attended this yoga class, I should be good now?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I can remember doing that too. Like I should be here on this journey. Like I shouldn't be where I am. I should be there. Or the frustration with the ebb and flow of it all. Certainly at different parts in the recovery journey, it's 5 steps forward, 3 steps back, and that's hard to, you know, keep the endurance going for sometimes. That temptation to give up can be really strong at times. Yeah, so healing isn't linear, and I'm sure other people really agree with that. It's certainly in my experience, it's not a process. It's not a linear process, and so if we can accept that, right, and rather be hard on ourselves when we sense that maybe we've taken those a few steps back, rather than judge that, can we see, okay, why did I take those steps back? What does that even mean? Am I really actually taking steps back, or is it just part of the process of there's something in these steps that I need to learn to be able to continue on my path, right? That there's really, like, struggle is part of the journey, right? And so when we, maybe fall out of pattern with something, rather than judge that, can we give ourselves some self-compassion and say, okay, today I begin again? Because in the end, what matters most is that we begin again. So begin again has certainly been one of my mantras and words that I share with my clients and community, because we don't need to shame ourselves. We can just begin again, and that's okay.
I love that. I think that's so important because, I can really identify with, just being in this place where, I get to a point in my healing. I'm like, okay, I'm good. I've worked through all this. And then it comes up again. So
Absolutely.
then, then it took me a while to realize, hey, these are just different layers of the
Yeah,
same situation that we're just mastering.
exactly. Right. So, yoga would teach us that, this through self-study, we integrate what we learn and then we grow. Right. And so, like you said in your example, like you thought you worked on it, you bumped up against it again, but you've learned from going through it before, something like you have information with you this time that you didn't have before, right? And so it's like we just keep evolving with these situations, and it can be mad and very frustrating. But if we can hold on to, well, I have more information this time, I'm evolving, then maybe we can move through it and not be so angry at ourselves.
I'm all for that. Yeah, it took a while. I would just be like, none of this is working.
I know.
When in
I
a
know.
sense it actually is. We're just getting to a new level. And that's one of the things I appreciate about your book is because you really kind of talk about that, in a way that people will look at their journey with more kindness.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So where do you think people sometimes get hung up?
I think there's lots of ways people can get hung up. I mean, I can think of my own journey, what you just said, the frustration of, you know, thinking you figured something out and you realizing you haven't fully, or thinking you should be done with whatever it is that you're going through and you're not. Um, wanting it to be a short-term situation. And this is something that I strive to be really honest about my book, is that it's actually not a short-term situation. A lot of times our healing is a long-term situation, and it requires a commitment. And that's why healing is so courageous, is because it requires a long-term commitment. At least that's my experience. And so I'm not trying to sell you a short-term quick fix here at all. It takes perseverance and courage, and it's a long-term commitment.
Do you find that sometimes people get into this place of fear and that's kind of where they can kind of get stopped and have a difficult time moving through?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, fear is such a human experience. Absolutely. I think our yoga practices and philosophies can help us explore fear and empower us to move through it. But I think it's important that we don't put timelines on how quickly we need to move through something, that we take the time that we need. We don't need that pressure of a timeline to have something figured out. And, we can ask for support. We can draw on community. We can take our time with moving through a fear. I think what matters most is the commitment to move through it versus the timeline as to when it happens.
It would seem that sometimes people can get a little stuck and avoid it or what have you. But I was real impressed because your book does talk about taking that courageous approach to like addressing your fears.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fear was a big part of my story for sure. And so how do we kind of acknowledge our fear, name it, be able to breathe with it, right? And be able to imagine what's on the other side of it and take the steps to move toward the other side of it.
Well, in your book, you talk about how it's important that we realize that we're more than a body. Can you expand on that for our listeners?
So I draw on the yogic concept called the koshas. The koshas is a framework that teaches that we are whole as we are. And within our wholeness, we are made of 5 layers. The first layer being the physical body, right? So everything of the body. And then there's the breath layer, the mind emotion layer, the wisdom layer, and the bliss layer. And so I find that, I found for myself when I learned about this framework for my recovery, it was so profound to get to know these other layers of myself, right? So it helped me take the acute focus off of my physical self and get to know these other areas of myself, right? So when I say that, it's not to suggest that you aren't your body, because that is a huge part of who you are. And it's not to ask you to ignore your body or pretend your body isn't a part of your identity or who you are. It's more coming from this koshas model to help us get to know ourselves beyond just that external aspect of our being, right? And so for eating disorder, because for many there's such an intense focus on body image, this recognition of there's more to us than our bodies is really important.
How important is it that we find the correct role models to follow or to maybe pay attention to? Because there are so many out there that talk about maybe, working insane hours to make things
Mm-hmm.
happen, or, not taking care of your body in another way,
Mm-hmm.
too focused on, losing that 10 pounds in like 2 days. So how do we choose the right mentors to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, for me, role models have been so key, role models, mentors. And for me, those are people who kind of embody the values that are important to me, or that I'm looking to be able to embody myself. Also, my children, and I write about this, they are my everyday role models. Watching them, how they relate to their bodies and food and emotions and, play and um, just how present they are. Boy, going through that, coming out of that relapse and having two small children to demonstrate these things to me was incredibly powerful. Um, so I think, for, you know, taking taking time to acknowledge like what values are important to you, what values do you value, and who around you exhibits those values. And looking to those individuals or groups to help support you in cultivating those values in yourself. And remembering that you don't have to continue following people on social media who aren't, exhibiting values that align with those that you're wishing to cultivate, or the values that align with a recovery mindset and lifestyle. You can give yourself permission to unfollow. And that's completely appropriate.
Thank goodness for that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
because there's a lot of um, stuff out there that probably not as helpful as it could be for people. And I was so impressed at how your book really touches on that and how important it is to have these role models in place.
Yeah, thank you.
When we talk about, we get to this place where we're working on ourselves, if it's, weight, work ethics, whatever the issue is, do we have, is it important that we grieve our former selves?
Well, certainly for me, it was. And I know for those in the eating disorder community who are, beginning to imagine who they are without their disorder, because that's becomes such a deep part of one's identity. And again, I'm saying eating disorder, but you can put in, you know, different words there based on your own situation. Um, having to grieve that identity was really important to be able to move forward, because in grieving that identity, I was letting go of approaching, you know, living my life through this mental illness, this way of coping. And I had to face all the fears that came with letting it go, because it provides a false sense of power and control and safety and comfort, right? So of course you need to grieve those things that you feel are serving you, even though you know they aren't. Um, so it's grief, and not to sound corny, but a little bit of rebirth, I think. And I think I've worked with a lot of people who naturally go through a grieving process when they're preparing to let go of a certain way of living, or an identity that's they've been enmeshed with for a long time.
Well, I can understand that. I think most of us have learned certain behaviors and that we've kind of just been with our entire lifetime. So it seems like most of the time you hear people talk about how their parents raised them just enough so that they could start therapy,
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
because we've got to bring all this stuff to the table. Things have changed so much, thank goodness,
yeah.
and I really have some great appreciation for that, because isn't it about time that we open this door and start talking about this?
Absolutely. I obviously agree wholeheartedly. Wholeheartedly.
So, is there a time that we can actually get to this place of inner peace?
And I think that's such an individual experience. I think, you know, I think there's something important about recognizing that inner peace may not be a permanent thing, right? Like, we might get to inner peace by recognizing that inner peace ebbs and flows, versus it becoming something that we are trying to pin down and hold in place, um, in a way that isn't realistic, if that makes sense, right? Yeah, it's such a big question. I, I I think it's a journey. I think it's part of the process of healing that we flow in and out of peace. And when we're not in peace, being present to what we are in and remembering that we can feel peace. And how do we bring that forward again? What steps do we take? How do we be active in that process of creating peace in our lives, recognizing that it ebbs and flows?
I think that that's so important because you're so right. The inner peace is just such a journey for everybody, but it's not something that I think is unattainable. Sometimes you hear people go, inner peace. I don't know if I can ever get that.
Right, right. So it's, I think giving people an opportunity to just define for themselves. So when we say inner peace, what does that even mean? What does that mean for you? What does that mean for me? Maybe it's connected to a setting, maybe it's being at the ocean that brings someone inner peace, right? I think there's so many different ways that we can approach this topic. And I would say I want to empower people to explore it for themselves. What does that mean to you?
Do you find that sometimes it's just a shift in perspective for people? Because it seems like, while inner peace can be so elusive, it's also maybe looking at things in a new way.
I think so. Absolutely. I think our perspective is really key. That doesn't minimize circumstances going on that might be very, very difficult and very challenging, right? So, yeah, it's such a big question.
I guess I'm hitting you with all the big questions today, right?
Yeah, I don't have all the answers.
Hey, do you know what? Who does? Who
Yeah.
does?
Yeah.
But I like how in your book you talk about things that are obtainable for a lot of people, like working to stay in the moment. And that's such a big deal because so often we're putting worry out into the future or regret in the past, and we're not really staying in the present moment, that's the only thing that we really have control of with ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah. It's a practice, that's for sure.
So what do you want listeners to take away from your book?
I just would welcome listeners to, take away an opportunity to explore their own courageous path to healing that they've been on in their lives. Maybe they're right now, or they have it at other times in their lives, but to have an opportunity to just reflect on their strengths, their gifts, their talents, their courageousness, their ability to persevere, to do hard things, and to gain just some sense of awareness of those strengths, right? Because I feel like when we're going through very difficult, challenging times, we can lose sight of those qualities within ourselves. But they're really the things that get us through. So I want to support people in recognizing what they're overcoming and what they have overcome. Support people in realizing that, this is a long-term commitment and they have it in them to move forward, to keep going, to give people permission to ask for support, and to know that they deserve to be heard, seen, and validated.
Committing to ourselves and to our recovery. And how important is that peace in everything that we're doing?
Yeah, I think when we are committed, we're intentional, we're purposeful, we're present. We are, we're on a path. We're not just kind of rambling in multiple directions without, purpose. So I think that commitment can become an anchor, right? And help make ourselves a priority, right? And to come back to self-worth. It's like, if I make this commitment, then I'm making this commitment. I'm showing myself that I'm worthy. I'm worthy of this commitment. It might not always feel that way, right? But putting that into practice is so important.
Well, Jennifer, what website can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
Absolutely. Yoga for, which the number 4, yoga4eatingdisorders.com.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you everyone who's listening.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to learn more about your book, The Courageous Path to Healing. The Courageous Path to Healing is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And remember, support our indie bookstores. we'd like to take a moment to share with you some of our sponsors that make this show possible.
Internationally recognized and award-winning author Judy Goodman works and teaches outside the box of limited thinking. Working with people from every walk of life, her goal is to empower you to be the best you can be, no matter what the challenge is. Born with the gift of seeing beyond our normal vision, she has an extraordinary gift of working with every challenge. Teaching beyond conventional wisdom, her work is described as life-changing. Visit judygoodman.com. That's judygoodman.com.
Have you ever had the sense that your thoughts might actually be doing something? Ancient secrets of manifesting have been masterfully revealed in the award-winning book Manifesting 1-2-3 by Ken Elliott. For the first time, the author's experiences and stories in this book describe exactly how your thoughts can create anything. You've been doing this all your life, but it's never been fully explained for you until now. Visit manifesting123.com for more information today. Manifesting123.com.
We can't say enough good things about our sponsors. Make sure to visit Judy Goodman at judygoodman.com for more information on her work or to book an appointment. Also, you'll want to learn about Manifesting 123. What a great resource that is. Visit manifesting123.com for more information and read the stories that people send in about how Manifesting 123 has changed their lives. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.